First of all, we are grateful to our revered Swamiji for arranging such a wonderful topic. What I would like to do in this 25 minutes is to analyze this problem from both the Western and Indian perspective. Of course, Western perspective I will be very briefly discussing, and with that background I would like to enter into a debate between the Mimamsakas and the Advaita. Why? Because the philosophy of action, this is what the term that is used in Western tradition, is something which is quite often discussed in the Western tradition, especially from the time of Immanuel Kant. This has become a very important issue for the Westerners. But we should note the fact that for all Western scholars, or they were able to discuss this issue purely from the phenomenal standpoint, not from the metaphysical standpoint, as we have it in Indian philosophical tradition. So, the title I have given for my paper is The Linguistification of the Sacred. The Linguistification of the Sacred. Now, when we talk about language, we always say in Indian tradition that language and thought are intimately related. For example, Patanjali says that the expression of thought is a sole purpose that is served by the use of words. So, to see the problem from Indian standpoint, one can say that there exists an implicit relation between language and thought, but it has been pointed out by many scholars like Harold Coward, who has written a beautiful book on Derrida and Spota theory, Coward says that Indian philosophers have approached the problem from two perspectives, the phenomenal as well as the metaphysical dimension. And also, if you come to J.J. Arapura, another great thinker from Canada, of course he is an Indian, he also says that Indian philosophers have carefully avoided the two reductionistic mistakes. What are these two reductionist mistakes? One is that reducing language as something, as a mode of thought, that's all. It is a phenomenal, trying to understand purely from the phenomenal standpoint. This is one way of understanding language. And another way of approaching language is to see everything from the metaphysical standpoint. So, J.J. Arapura says we have avoided that, Indian philosophers have avoided these two reductionistic mistakes. And another Western scholars I would like to quote is Jonas Bronkhorst. He has written a very important book on language as reality, wherein he argues that there exists a permanent relation between language and reality. This is what we have seen in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and the Upanishads also say that. And Karl Potter very beautifully talks about what is known as the linguistic turn of analytical philosophy in Indian tradition. This is a very beautiful statement which he has made. For example, recently I found out from the Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophies, volume 4, wherein he says that what the Indian philosophers have discussed is the linguistic turn, because now we are talking about the linguistic turn in the 20th century. But Indian philosophers have discussed this linguistic turn, because their way of understanding language and reality is something entirely different. And with regard to the philosophy of action which is discussed from the time of Kant, of course, Aristotle also talks about that, but in the modern period we can say it starts with Immanuel Kant, and he says that theory of action can be discussed from two standpoints. One of the commentator of Immanuel Kant is Richard McCarthy. He has written a book on Kant's theory of action, wherein he says that in Kant's philosophy there are two philosophy of theory of action which Kant is talking about. One is looking at the problem from the empirical or a determinist way of account of action. And the other is non-determinist action, wherein human freedom predominates. So these are two ways of understanding Immanuel Kant, keeping the philosophy of action at the backdrop. And this is what many philosophers have discussed. But what is very interesting is, in the hermeneutical tradition, this problem has been discussed at length. For example, in hermeneutics of Gadamer as well as Paul Ricoeur, we see that action is considered as a text. Action as a text is something very, very interesting in the hermeneutical tradition. And it should be noted that when we are talking about action, what the hermeneutical tradition says is that action here means social action, wherein we expect the social actors to participate, which means the subjective element of the author or the person who is making some action is not at all important, but the social action is very important. The way in which social actors play their role is very significant, very important. That has to be given primary importance according to the hermeneutical tradition. So this means action can be seen as a text. This is a very, very beautiful idea, because there is always different ways of understanding action. Now, when we say philosophy of action as a text, this means the prejudice of the individual is not important. They are sidelined. But when we see action as a text, we try to say, when we are reading the text, the role of the author is not important. So we are trying to transcend that. So similarly, we can see the significance of action by keeping the action in the social context. Similarly, if you come to the phenomenological tradition, it is Anna Hadent who wrote a very beautiful book on human condition, wherein she talks about the distinction between labor and action. In fact, she says there is what is called vita activa and vita contemplativa, and she shows the distinction where one can make a clear-cut distinction between labor and action. So this is what the Western philosophers have discussed with regard to the philosophy of action. But what I am trying to say is, the entire discourse in Western tradition simply focuses on language, but they try to look at language purely from the phenomenal standpoint. That is, language as a mode of communication. So the philosophy of action or reading action as a text is a part of it. That's all. Beyond that, they could not go till now. But if you look at Indian philosophical tradition, there is a different way of understanding the term action. This is quite fascinating, especially if you look at the dialectics between the Mimamsakas and Advaitins. It is very clear that action is not mere action, it is a communicative action. This is what Habermas talks about, for example, in the Western tradition. Because when Habermas wrote the 2 volumes on theory of communicative action, it was praised like anything, because of course it's a very beautiful book, wherein he considers that action is not mere action, there is a communication that is involved in action. But once again, I would like to say this is not something new, because in the writings of Searle as well as Austin, we see about this action-oriented sentences. But when Habermas talks about this communicative action, it means that all actions are involved, or they have a center. What is that center? That is communication. So this, when this was popularized in the West, philosophers throughout the globe were saying this communicative action is something very beautiful, very important. But if you closely observe Indian philosophical tradition, especially the dialectic between the Mimamsakas and Advaitins, one can see the communicative action is not alien to us. It is very much present in Indian philosophical tradition. Of course, I cannot speak about Indian philosophical tradition when two giants are there. My Guruji is here, this side, and that side another Guruji is there, and he is very much well versed in Advaita and Mimamsakas. In fact, sir is going to talk about Mimamsakas, but let me try to see from my standpoint. Now, how do we approach this problem? Now, when we come to the Mimamsakas, we know the main focus of the Vedas, main focus of the Mimamsaka is the Vedas, and they argued that all philosophical discussions arise just in connection with some exegetical standpoint. So this means there is always action-oriented sentences which has been emphasized in the Mimamsakas. In fact, different schools use different terms. For example, the word Karya is used, Karman is used, Vyapara is used, Bhava is used, and another substantive are used. But if you look at the Mimamsakas, it is very much important to see how the sacred text how the sacred text contain action-oriented sentences. For example, take this known statement of the Mimamsakas: the one who is desirous to reach heaven should make a sacrifice. Now, this sentence has got lot of signification with regard to the communicative action which the Westerners talk about, because here there are three important components which have to be taken into account. For example, there is an object which is Swarga, and there is an instrument by which you can reach Swarga, that is yaga, and third is the procedure by which you can attain that is by your individual effort. So this method of understanding the Vedic text is something remarkable, and if you read the Mimamsakas very closely, you would observe that the communicative action which the Westerners talk about is not something new to us. Now let us see how the Mimamsakas and the Advaitins are discussing about this communicative action. So for me, action here means it is a communicative action, and this communicative action, according to me, is well presented, in fact, in the Mimamsakas. But though the Advaitins have some difficulty in accepting some word. So I'll just read it quickly. So the Mimamsakas and the Advaitins are the two systems which are very close to the Vedic or scriptural authority, and so these two systems are additionally interested in justifying the authority of the Vedas and also in the hermeneutics of Vedic text. So one source of it is the secular statement, that is Laukika Vakyas of trustworthy persons, and another source is the scriptural statement, that is Vaidika Vakyas contained in the Vedas. Now, the role of secular and scriptural text as source of knowledge, pramana, has been discussed at length both by the Mimamsakas and the Advaitins. There is a difference of opinion not only between the Mimamsakas and the Advaitins regarding the validity of these texts, but the Mimamsakas themselves are divided on this issue. A verbal statement, be it secular or scriptural, may convey information about an existent entity. Such a statement is called a Siddha Vastu Bodhaka Vakya. The statement "fire is hot" gives information about fire, an existent entity. We have also scriptural statements such as Brahman is real, knowledge and infinite, which are existential in as much as they give information about Brahman, the existent entity. There are also verbal statements which are injunctive, that is Vidhi Vakyas, while the injunctive statement "bring the cow" is a secular statement, Laukika Vakya. The injunctive statement "one who desires to reach heaven should perform Jyotishtoma sacrifice" is a Vedic statement. Now let us first consider the standpoint of the Mimamsakas on this problem. Though Kumarila accepts the validity of both assertive and injunctive statements which are secular, in the case of scriptural statement, he restricts the validity to injunctive statements alone. But the Prabhakaras hold the view that only injunctive statements, whether Vedic or not, have validity in keeping the pragmatic attitude he takes of all knowledge. A meaningful statement, according to him, should lead to communicative action. This is what I've been stressing from the standpoint of Habermas and others. So, a meaningful statement, according to Prabhakara, should lead to communicative action. And when a statement fails to do this, okay, then the purpose of the language is not fulfilled. Further, the Prabhakara maintains that we learn the meanings of the words and sentences through communicative action. A very beautiful example is given. For example, in a house, the father tells the servant that bring the cow and untie the horse. A child who hears these two statements tries to understand the meaning of the word untie and the word bring. And also the child learns the meaning of the word cow and horse. This is how we practice our language. We teach the language, the function of the language to a child. Now, this is very important because what the Mimamsakas would argue here is that whenever we are making a statement, there is the verb is very important. The verb, according to them, is the nucleus of the sentence, which means when we are reading these two important theories of meaning, Anvita Bidhanavada and Abhitanvayavada, it is argued by the Mimamsakas that verb is the nucleus of the sentence and other parts of the sentence go around this. Why? Because the verb always makes the person to perform some action or other. So it is based on this fact, one can say that all sentences are action oriented. So all sentences are, according to the Mimamsakas, action oriented sentences only. So communicative action is taking place here. So both for Kumarila as well as Prabhakara, they hold the general thesis that the purport of the entire Veda is action. So according to them, Veda talks about action only, because Veda, being a book of commandments, consists of injunctions and prohibitions, that is Vidhi and Nisheda, what Professor Bhatta said in the morning. Then the question is, if so, when it comes to a scripture, not only the Prabhakara but also Kumarila restrict the validity of the injunctive statement alone. Then one may ask what about the validity of assertive statement, Siddha Vastu Bodhaka Vakyas, which are found in the Vedas. Now, here I find that there is something very, very interesting, the interesting argument given by the Prabhakaras as well as the the Bhattas. Now, the argument is quite interesting for the main reason that if the assertive sentences are occurring in Vedas, that has to be seen only in the context of the injunctive sentences, which means assertive sentences contained in the Vedas are significant only when they are construed along with the appropriate injunctive text. So it is interesting to note in this connection that the Mimamsakas treat both the Arthavadas and Vedanta Vakya alike as a subsidiary. This is very important, subsidiary to the Vidhi Vakyas. It means that the former texts do not have an independent validity of their own, but become valid only when they are construed along with the later text. So the Vedanta texts which are assertive in character and which has been deprived of the independent validity by the Mimamsakas. Now, this argument is very beautiful, but look at the Advaitins standpoint. Though the Advaitins are also interested in the theory of communicative action, they are not willing to accept the Mimamsaka standpoint because the theory of communicative action has to be justified by relying on the injunctive text on one hand and the theory of the centrality of the verb in a sentence on the other. I am not elaborating this argument. what the advisors are trying to say is, the verb cannot be the nucleus of the sentence. That is, we can't say, according to advisors, we can't say that all sentences are action-oriented sentences. On the other hand, we know, just now we have seen, the Mimamsakas argue that all sentences are action-oriented, and even the other sentences which are assertive in nature has to be construed along with these injunctive sentences so that their meaning can be known. So this is very clear from the standpoint of the Mimamsakas that all sentences are action-oriented. This is fine, the argument. But when you come to the advisors, it is very clear, the advisors do not admit that all sentences are action-oriented sentences. Now let me give one example from the advisors standpoint. The advisors reject the claim of the Prabhakaras that even secular statements are valid only if they lead to some kind of action. Now look at this argument. There are assertive statements like, luckily, this is a statement, luckily you are happy. Then another statement, a child is born to you, and so on, which do not prompt a person who hears them to an action, because these statements give information, that's all. When a child is born to you is only an information that is given to you according to advisors, but this can be questioned, of course. What is that? Because these statements give information about an existent something, about some state of affairs, that's all. This is what the advisors say. Now, the nature of such statement is such that they do not call for any kind of action on the part of the hearer. But I would say there is some problem, perhaps Sir can clarify that. How can when somebody comes and tells a person that a child is born to you, how can a person be silent and say as though nothing has happened? It always prompts a person to perform some, if it is his own child, immediately you will run to see the baby, isn't it? So, but the advisors argue, in fact, when this beautiful discussion was taught by my teacher R. Balasubramanian, in fact, I wrote this in a detailed essay in Chattopadhyay's volume, that fifth volume, what we call, on the same topic, linguistification of the sacred, some 40 pages article, lengthy article, wherein I argued that the standpoint of the advisor is right up to this but after that, let us see how the argument goes. So the nature of these statements is such that they do not call for any kind of action on the part of the hearer. The statement do have communicative competence. This is how one can interpret that. One can say that there is communicative competence is very much there, but there is no communicative action which is involved as the Mimamsakas prescribe. Now look at this statement, shut the door, bring the book. These two statements immediately calls for some action. If I am uttering the sentence, shut the door, if my peon or if my servant performs this action, then this means he has understood the meaning of that. If he is silent, then there are two things. One is he doesn't want to obey my order, or he may not hear my what I said. So there are, please conclude. Thank you very much. So what I am trying to say is, I'll complete in 2 minutes. So there is always a scope for action, no doubt, but not in the case of assertive sentences. Assertive sentences can be simply heard and it will not involve a person to ask. Mandana very beautifully says that with regard to this action-oriented sentence, there are two things can be raised. One is upaya, for example, the means, the childbirth, or the end, namely upeya, happiness. So, childbirth, which is a means of happiness to the person concerned, has already taken place and there is nothing to be done there too. This is a very, very slippery argument, I feel. And another statement is given by Mandana. There is a treasure beneath this place. A person, Mandana says, a person who has the competence to understand the meaning of the statement may endeavor to dig the place for the purpose of getting hold of the treasure, or keep quiet. One may keep quiet also. When somebody utters this statement, I may not be interested because I cannot dig this place, police will catch me or Swami will kill me. So that is another thing. So after hearing the statement also, one can simply keep quiet. So there is no action that is involved. So this beautiful dialogue between the Prabhakaras and the Mimamsakas very clearly tell us that for the Mimamsaka it is very clear, all sentences are action oriented sentences because there is the verb is a nucleus, but the Advaitins will not accept this position. And what I am trying to say is the communicative action which is so much popular in Western tradition, especially after the emergence of Habermas and others, is very much present in Indian tradition. And that too, there is a way of looking at our own tradition from a different standpoint. Now, this approach is avoiding the two reductionistic mistake, as I said in the beginning. So, it is very much essential for us to go back to our Indian tradition and see the significance of the so-called communicative action or the relation that exists between language and reality. So, the term, the topic of my lecture, that is the linguistification of the sacred that is Vedas, which is sacred by nature, contains all injunctive sentences which convey the significant relation that exists between language and reality. That is the reason why we say it is a linguistification of the sacred. We can make the sacred truth through language. That is, language and reality are intimately related, and that can be known by using language not as a mode of communication, but as a method of understanding the metaphysical reality. With this, I thank our revered Swamiji and other members of this Sri Vishnu Mohan Foundation for this wonderful opportunity. And also, it is my pleasure to present my paper in presence of two my great gurus who are specialized in Indian philosophy. I always afraid to talk about Indian philosophy in presence of scholars, but as my teacher used to say that I came to Indian philosophy very late, because he used to charge Dayakrishna also by saying that he has come to Indian philosophy very late. But it doesn't matter whether one comes first or one comes last. In a cow, horns, they grow later. Ears and other parts of the body are born with the cow, but horns are growing after some time only. But the horns are very strong. Thank you very much.